Welcome to Midnight Murmur. Here, the night comes alive with chilling tales and spine-tingling stories. If you crave the thrill of the unknown and the eerie whisper of the supernatural, you've found your new haunt. Join us as we dive into the darkest corners of the human mind, unraveling short horror stories that will keep you up at night. Hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and let the murmur begin. The Smiling Man. Part 1. The Encounter. It was a cold Friday night in October when I first saw him. I had just left my friend's apartment after a movie night, and I was walking home through the dimly lit streets of our quiet suburban neighborhood. The air was crisp, the leaves crunched under my feet, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the highway. As I turned onto Maple Street, I noticed a figure standing under a streetlight about a block ahead. He was tall and thin, wearing a suit that seemed just a bit too small for his frame. His head was tilted slightly to one side, and he was staring directly at me. Despite the distance, I could see that he had an unnaturally wide smile plastered across his face. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something about his smile was deeply unsettling, but I shrugged it off as just another weirdo in the city. I continued walking, keeping my eyes on the ground to avoid making eye contact. As I got closer, I realized that he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, smiling. My heart began to race, and I quickened my pace. When I was about 20 feet away from him, he suddenly started walking towards me, his smile never wavering. I froze. There was something in his eyes, a glint of madness that made my blood run cold. Without thinking, I turned and ran back the way I had come. I didn't stop running until I reached my friend's apartment and banged on the door, gasping for breath. "What the hell happened to you?" my friend asked, letting me inside. I saw something," I stammered. "A man. He was smiling at me." My friend laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by a Halloween prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Part 2. The Stalker. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't get the smiling man out of my mind. I saw him everywhere, standing on street corners, lurking in alleyways, even outside my window at night. Each time, he was just standing there, smiling that same eerie smile. I tried to ignore him, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the sightings became more frequent, and the fear began to consume me. I started avoiding going out at night, and even during the day, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. One night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and saw the smiling man standing outside, his face pressed against the glass. His smile was wider than ever, and his eyes were filled with a malevolent gleam. I screamed and grabbed my phone to call the police, but when I looked back at the window, he was gone. The police arrived and searched the area, but they found no sign of him. They told me it was probably just a prankster, but I knew better. Part 3. The Revelation. I became desperate to find out who the smiling man was and why he was tormenting me. I started researching online, looking for any clues or similar stories. That's when I stumbled upon an old forum post about a man named Samuel Grayson. Samuel Grayson was a notorious serial killer from the 1950s who was known for his unsettling smile. According to the post, he had been executed for his crimes, but there were rumors that his spirit still haunted the streets, seeking out new victims to terrorize. I was horrified. Could it be that the smiling man was the ghost of Samuel Grayson? It seemed impossible, but the evidence was mounting. I decided to visit the old asylum where Grayson had been held before his execution, hoping to find some answers. The asylum was abandoned, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. As I explored the dark, crumbling halls, I felt a growing sense of dread. Finally, I reached the cell where Grayson had spent his final days. Carved into the walls were hundreds of smiling faces, each one more grotesque than the last. In the center of the cell, I found a journal. It was filled with ramblings about eternal life and the power of fear. One entry caught my eye. "I will live forever in the minds of those who fear me. My smile will haunt them until the end of time." As I read those words, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around and saw the smiling man standing behind me, his grin wider than ever. I screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember is his cold, dead eyes staring into mine as everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned faces. They told me I had been found unconscious in the old asylum and had been in a coma for weeks. No one believed my story about the smiling man, dismissing it as a result of my trauma. But I know the truth. The smiling man is real, and he will never stop haunting me. I see him in my nightmares, and sometimes I even catch a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. His smile will be the last thing I see before I die. Story 2. The Whispering Woods. Part 1. The Camping Trip. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My friends and I had planned a camping trip to celebrate the end of the semester. We chose a remote spot in the Whispering Woods, a dense forest known for its eerie silence and towering trees. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, set up our tents, and started a campfire. As the sun set, we shared stories and laughed, enjoying the freedom of being away from the stress of school. The night was calm, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. As the night grew darker, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and a thick fog rolled in, enveloping our campsite. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the woods was unnerving, and I kept hearing faint whispers coming from the trees. I told myself it was just the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. It sounded like multiple voices, all speaking in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, I heard a blood-curdling scream. I bolted upright and rushed out of my tent, only to find my friends doing the same. We looked around, but there was no sign of anyone else in the woods. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. They nodded, their faces pale with fear. We decided to stay close to the fire for the rest of the night, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding darkness. Part 2. The Disappearance. The next morning, we tried to shake off the previous night's events and enjoy the day. We went hiking, explored the forest, and even found a small, hidden lake where we spent the afternoon swimming. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to the campsite. The fog returned, thicker than before, and the whispers started again. This time, they were louder and more insistent, as if they were trying to tell us something. We huddled around the fire, trying to ignore the eerie sound. Suddenly, one of my friends, Sarah, stood up and walked towards the trees. "Sarah, where are you going?" I called after her. She didn't respond. She just kept walking, her eyes glazed over as if she were in a trance. We ran after her, but she disappeared into the fog. We searched for hours, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. We returned to the campsite, exhausted and terrified. None of us slept that night, the whispers growing louder and more frantic with each passing hour. Part 3. The Revelation. The next day, we decided to leave the Whispering Woods and report Sarah's disappearance to the authorities. As we packed up our gear, we noticed strange symbols carved into the trees around our campsite. They looked ancient, like some kind of ritual markings. We hurriedly left the forest and made our way to the nearest town. The local police were skeptical of our story, but they agreed to send a search party into the woods to look for Sarah. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of her. The whispers haunted me day and night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her. One night, I was awoken by the sound of whispering in my room. I sat up and saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was Sarah. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was pale and lifeless. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I reached out to her, but she vanished before my eyes. Terrified, I began researching the history of the Whispering Woods, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. I discovered that the forest had once been the site of a series of gruesome rituals performed by a cult known as the Whispers. They believed that by sacrificing innocent souls, they could gain eternal life and power. The cult had been disbanded decades ago, but it seemed that their malevolent spirits still lingered in the woods. Desperate to save Sarah, I returned to the Whispering Woods alone. I followed the whispers, hoping they would lead me to her. The fog was thicker than ever, and the symbols on the trees seemed to glow with an eerie light. Finally, I reached a clearing where I found an ancient stone altar. Lying on the altar was Sarah, her body lifeless and cold. The whispers grew deafening, and I felt a malevolent presence all around me. I knew I had to perform a ritual to free her soul. Using the information I had gathered, I chanted the incantations and made the necessary offerings. The whispers turned into screams, and the ground shook violently. Suddenly, the fog lifted, and the forest fell silent. Sarah's body vanished, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that her soul was finally free, but the Whispering Woods would never be the same. The spirits of the Whisperers still lingered, waiting for their next victim. And I knew that as long as the forest stood, the whispers would never truly be silenced. Story 3. The Dollmaker's Curse. Part 1. The Discovery. In a small, forgotten town nestled in the countryside, there was an old, abandoned mansion that had been the subject of countless rumors and ghost stories. The townspeople called it the Dollmaker's House, and they said it was cursed. The mansion had once belonged to a man named Victor Hargrave, a renowned dollmaker known for his lifelike creations. But one day, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind his workshop filled with unfinished dolls. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to explore the mansion. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of adventure, I made my way to the outskirts of town and approached the decaying structure. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and the windows were boarded up, but I managed to find a way inside. The interior was exactly as I had imagined: dust-covered furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I made my way to the workshop, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The room was filled with unfinished dolls, their glass eyes staring blankly into the void. Some were missing limbs, others had cracked faces, but all of them seemed disturbingly lifelike. On the workbench, I found a journal belonging to Victor Hargrave. The journal detailed his descent into madness. He had become obsessed with creating the perfect doll, one that could move and speak like a real person. He wrote about strange rituals and dark magic, claiming that he had found a way to trap souls inside his creations. Part 2. The Awakening. As I read the journal, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The last entry was particularly disturbing. I have done it. I have created the perfect doll. She moves, she speaks, she is alive. But something is wrong. She is not what I intended. She is evil. I must destroy her before it is too late. Suddenly, I heard a soft giggle behind me. I turned around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and saw one of the dolls standing upright. Her eyes glowed with a sinister light, and her lips curled into a malevolent smile. "Hello," she said in a sweet, childlike voice. "Do you want to play?" I stumbled backward, knocking over a shelf of dolls. They all tumbled to the floor, their glass eyes glinting in the dim light. The doll took a step towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural. I ran out of the workshop and into the hallway, but the door slammed shut behind me. The house seemed to come to life, the walls pulsating and the floorboards creaking under my feet. I could hear the sound of tiny footsteps following me, accompanied by that same eerie giggle. I made my way to the attic, hoping to find a way out. The attic was filled with more dolls, all of them watching me with their lifeless eyes. In the center of the room, I found a large, ornate box. Inside was the perfect doll that Victor Hargrave had written about. She was beautiful, with porcelain skin and long, flowing hair. But there was something deeply unsettling about her. Her eyes seemed to follow me, and her smile was cold and cruel. "Please, let me out," she whispered. "I just want to be free." Part 3. The Curse. I knew I had to destroy the doll, but as I reached for her, the other dolls in the attic came to life. They swarmed around me, their tiny hands clawing at my clothes and hair. I fought them off, grabbing the doll and making my way to the window. With all my strength, I hurled the doll out of the window and watched as she shattered on the ground below. The other dolls fell lifeless, and the house grew silent once more. I thought it was over, but as I made my way back down the stairs, I heard a familiar giggle. The shattered pieces of the doll began to move, slowly piecing themselves back together. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and I knew that the curse was far from broken. I fled the mansion, never looking back. The townspeople never believed my story, dismissing it as the ravings of a madman. But I know the truth. The dollmaker's curse is real, and his creations still haunt that old mansion, waiting for their next victim. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that eerie giggle echoing in the darkness.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling content.